The autumn rain hammered against the windows of the Essex County Archives in Salem, Massachusetts, as Dr. Rebecca Hart carefully lifted the deteriorating photograph from its protective sleeve. October 2024 had brought an unusual cold front that swept down from Canada, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. The archive's ancient heating system clanked and groaned, struggling against the penetrating chill that seemed to seep through the century-old brick walls like water through a sieve. Outside, the streets of Salem glistened with rain, and tourists hurried past with umbrellas bent against the wind, their Halloween plans dampened by the unseasonable weather. Rebecca had spent 15 years as the head archivist at Essex County, cataloguing thousands of historical documents, photographs, and records that told the story of one of America's oldest regions. She'd handled everything from colonial-era property deeds to Civil War correspondence, from witch trial transcripts to Prohibition-era bootlegging records. But nothing, absolutely nothing in her professional experience had prepared her for what she was about to discover in the Caldwell family collection. The photograph, dated 1873, showed 8 young cousins arranged on the front steps of what appeared to be a grand Victorian mansion. The children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 16, stood in formal poses typical of the era, their faces bearing that characteristic solemnity demanded by long exposure times and the rigid social conventions of Victorian photography. Rebecca had been tasked with digitizing the Caldwell family collection donated by the estate of Margaret Caldwell, the last surviving member of one of Salem's oldest and most reclusive families. Margaret had died at 97, alone in the same mansion where her ancestors had lived for over 2 centuries, surrounded by the ghosts of a past she'd refused to discuss with anyone. Rebecca adjusted her magnifying glass, studying the minute details of the photograph with the practiced eye of an expert. The children wore their finest clothes, dark fabrics and white collars that spoke of wealth and elevated social standing. The boys in their wool suits with brass buttons, the girls in their elaborate dresses with lace collars and ribbons in their carefully arranged hair. Behind them, the mansion's door stood slightly ajar, revealing an impenetrable darkness within, like a mouth opened to swallow light. The architectural details were exquisite: carved molding, ornate hinges, a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. But it was the reflection in the window beside the door that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat, that made her pulse quicken with a mixture of confusion and inexplicable dread. 9 faces stared forward from the glass, not 8. 9. She counted again, her finger trembling slightly as she pointed to each child in the photograph, then to each reflection. The mathematics was impossible. 8 children stood on those steps, but 9 reflections gazed out from the window's surface, as clear and distinct as the actual subjects. Rebecca reached for her phone, her mind racing through rational explanations. A double exposure? A developing error? But the photograph showed no other signs of technical failure. The image was remarkably clear for its age, the reflections sharp and well-defined. She zoomed in on her phone's camera, capturing the anomaly. The 9th face belonged to a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, positioned slightly behind the others in the reflection. Her expression was different from the formal stiffness of the other children. She appeared to be screaming. The archive's door creaked open, and Rebecca jumped, nearly dropping her phone. Daniel Torres, a graduate student from Boston University who volunteered on weekends, entered with 2 cups of coffee. He was 24, energetic, with an infectious enthusiasm for local history that reminded Rebecca why she'd fallen in love with this work in the first place. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Daniel said, setting a cup beside her. The irony of his words, given Salem's reputation, wasn't lost on either of them. "What did you find?" Rebecca gestured to the photograph. "Look at this. Count the children." Then count the reflections. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, his coffee forgotten. She watched his eyes move from the photograph to the reflection and back again. That's not possible. Is it a trick photograph? Some kind of Victorian-era Photoshop? I don't think so. Look at the quality of the image. If this were manipulated, we'd see evidence of it. Double exposures leave traces. This is seamless. Rebecca pulled up the digital archives on her computer. The Caldwell family history is extensive. 8 children born to Harrison and Constance Caldwell between 1857 and 1868. All their names are recorded: William, Edmund, Charlotte, Victoria, James, Henry, Eleanor, and Catherine. 8 children, 8 names. Daniel pulled up a chair, his academic curiosity fully engaged now. But 9 faces in the reflection. Who's the 9th child? Rebecca navigated through the family records, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Birth certificates, baptismal records, school enrollments, all meticulously preserved. The Caldwells had been obsessive record keepers, documenting every detail of their lives. But as she searched, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. "Look at this," she said, pulling up a newspaper clipping from the Salem Evening News, dated November 1873. 2 months after this photograph was taken, one of the children disappeared. Eleanor Caldwell, age 9. The article says she vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night. No signs of forced entry, no ransom note, nothing. She was simply gone. Daniel read over her shoulder. "It says here the police investigated for months, but found no trace of her. The family offered a substantial reward, but no one ever came forward with information." He paused, scrolling down. "Jesus, Rebecca, look at this notation. It says Eleanor's room was on the 2nd floor, facing the front of the house. The window in the photograph, where the 9th reflection appears, that would have been her window." The archive felt colder suddenly. Rebecca pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "Keep reading, there's more." And the newspaper archive revealed a disturbing sequence of events. Over the following decade, 3 more Caldwell children disappeared. Charlotte in 1876, age 17. Victoria in 1881, age 19. James in 1883, age 21. Each disappearance followed the same inexplicable pattern. They vanished from the mansion with no explanation, no evidence, no witnesses. Each time, the family's wealth and influence brought extensive police investigations, but nothing was ever found. No bodies, no clues, just absence. 4 children gone, Daniel whispered. Out of 8. That's half the family. Rebecca pulled up property records. The mansion still stands. It's been in the Caldwell family continuously since 1794. Margaret Caldwell lived there alone for the last 40 years of her life. According to her obituary, she never married, never had children. The estate is being managed by a law firm downtown, Lancaster and Webb. They're handling the donation of all these materials. "We need to see that house," Daniel said. "If there's any explanation for what happened to those children, it might be there." Rebecca knew he was right, but something in her resisted. The photograph on her desk seemed to pulse with an unnamed dread. That 9th face, frozen in a silent scream in a reflection that shouldn't exist, whispered of secrets better left buried. But the archivist in her, the historian who dedicated her life to uncovering truth, couldn't turn away. She reached for her phone and dialed the number listed for Lancaster and Webb. The law office of Lancaster and Webb occupied the 3rd floor of a converted textile mill overlooking the North River. Rebecca and Daniel arrived the following Monday, armed with questions and the digitized photograph. Thomas Lancaster, a silver-haired man in his 60s, with the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing other people's grief and complications, welcomed them into a conference room lined with law books and framed historical maps of Essex County. "The Caldwell estate," Lancaster said, settling into a leather chair. "I've been handling Margaret's affairs for 30 years. Sad case, really. Brilliant woman, but terribly isolated. She rarely left that house, refused all social invitations, lived among her family's things like a curator in her own museum." Rebecca opened her laptop, displaying the photograph. "Mr. Lancaster, we found this in the archives. It's dated 1873, and it shows something impossible. We're hoping you might have records that could explain it." Lancaster studied the image, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine confusion as he counted the faces in the reflection. His hand moved to his collar, loosening his tie slightly. "I've never seen this particular photograph before." Margaret kept most of the family materials locked away in her private study. She only agreed to donate them after her diagnosis: pancreatic cancer. She had 6 months to settle her affairs. "The disappearances," Daniel said. 4 children vanished over a 10-year period. That's not just tragic, it's statistically impossible. 4 people don't just evaporate from the same family without some connection. Lancaster stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grey November sky. "I asked Margaret about the family history once, maybe 20 years ago. She told me some things are best forgotten, that the past should stay buried. I pressed her, asked if there was anything in the family records that might cause legal complications for the estate. She just looked at me with these haunted eyes and said, 'The house keeps its secrets, Mr. Lancaster, and so should we.'" "Did she ever explain what she meant by that?" Rebecca asked. "No, and I didn't ask again. There was something in her tone that made it clear the subject was closed." Lancaster returned to his seat. "The house is currently unoccupied. The estate needs to be cleared and prepared for sale. I can arrange access for you if you think there's something there worth finding. But I have to tell you, I've been in that house many times over the years, and there's something about it that feels wrong. Not haunted exactly, just wrong. Like the walls remember things they shouldn't." Rebecca and Daniel exchanged glances. "We'd like to see it," Rebecca said, "as part of the historical documentation process. If there are records there that explain these disappearances, they belong in the public archive." Lancaster pulled a set of keys from his desk drawer. The brass was tarnished with age, the keys themselves heavy and ornate. "The alarm code is 1794, the year the house was built. I'll arrange for the security company to expect you. But I'm going to give you some advice, Dr. Hart. Whatever you find there, whatever records or explanations you uncover, think carefully before making them public. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some truths don't bring closure. They just open new wounds." The Caldwell mansion stood at the end of a tree-lined street in Salem's historic district, set back from the road behind a wrought-iron fence thick with ivy. Rebecca and Daniel arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, the November light already fading into early dusk. The house was exactly as she'd imagined, a 3-story Victorian Gothic structure with a tower room on the northeast corner, dark shutters, and those distinctive windows that stared like hollow eyes. Dead leaves swirled across the overgrown front yard, and the wind carried the salt smell of the nearby ocean. Daniel paused at the gate, studying the mansion. "That tower window, do you think that was Eleanor's room?" Rebecca checked the photograph on her phone. The angles matched. The window where the 9th reflection had appeared was indeed part of the tower structure. "I think so. The newspaper said her room faced the front of the house. That would be it." They approached the front steps, where 8 children had posed 151 years ago. The wood was weathered but solid, and Rebecca could imagine them standing there, forced into stillness by their parents' demands and the photographer's lengthy exposure time. But try as she might, she couldn't place the 9th face. Couldn't find a position where an additional child might have stood unseen by the camera. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the interior. The alarm panel blinked in the hallway, and Rebecca quickly entered the code, 1794. The beeping stopped, leaving them in a silence so complete it felt like pressure against their eardrums. The house smelled of dust and old wood, and something else Rebecca couldn't quite identify. Something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. The interior had been preserved like a time capsule. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, and when Daniel found the light switches, the ancient electrical system reluctantly illuminated rooms packed with Victorian furniture, oil paintings in gilt frames, and shelves lined with leather-bound books. "It's like a museum," Daniel said, his voice hushed, "or a mausoleum." They moved through the first floor systematically, Rebecca photographing everything for the archive while Daniel took notes. The parlor contained formal sitting furniture arranged around a cold fireplace. Family portraits lined the walls, including a large painting of Harrison and Constance Caldwell with their 8 children. Rebecca studied the faces, matching them to the photograph. Eleanor stood between her parents, small for her age, with dark curls and serious eyes that seemed to follow the viewer's gaze. The dining room table was set for a meal that was never eaten, fine china and crystal gathering dust. In the library, thousands of books stood in perfect rows, organized by subject and date. A large desk dominated the room, and Rebecca carefully opened the drawers, finding correspondence, business records, and household accounts from the 1870s and 1880s. "Rebecca," Daniel called from the doorway, "I found stairs to the second floor. We should check the bedrooms." The staircase was grand, sweeping upward with mahogany banisters polished by generations of hands. Family photographs lined the wall, a visual chronicle of the Caldwell lineage. Rebecca paused at one particular image, dated 1872. The entire family stood in front of the house, all 8 children present. Eleanor was there, smiling slightly, her hand resting on her mother's arm. It was taken just 1 year before the photograph that had started this investigation, 1 year before her disappearance. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors. Daniel tried the nearest one, revealing a bedroom preserved exactly as it had been left over a century ago. A 4-poster bed, a dressing table, wardrobes full of clothes, everything perfectly maintained, waiting for occupants who would never return. They checked each room methodically. 6 bedrooms, all preserved as if the occupants had simply stepped out and might return at any moment. Clothes still hung in wardrobes. Books sat on nightstands. Hairbrushes and hand mirrors rested on dressing tables. It was profoundly unsettling, this perfect preservation, as if Margaret Caldwell had kept the rooms as shrines to her lost siblings. The tower room was locked with a mechanism that appeared newer than any other in the house. Rebecca tried each key on her ring methodically, her fingers trembling slightly, despite her attempts to remain calm and professional. None fit. The door was solid oak, aged to the color of dark honey, fitted so tightly in its frame that not even light showed beneath it. The lock itself was modern, installed perhaps in the last 50 years, its brass surface unmarred by the patina of age that covered everything else in this frozen museum of a house. Daniel examined the mechanism closely, pulling out his phone to shine a light into the keyhole. "This isn't original to the house," he observed. His voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something sleeping within. "Someone replaced the entire lock assembly, recently, within the last few decades, I'd guess." "We need to get in there," Rebecca said, hearing the edge of desperation in her own voice. "That's Eleanor's room. That's where the 9th reflection appeared in the photograph. Whatever happened to her? Whatever happened to all those children? The answer might be in there." "Lancaster might have the key," Daniel suggested, but Rebecca was already pulling out her phone, scrolling through the photos she'd taken of the house's exterior during their approach. She zoomed in on the tower window, her mind working through the architectural implications. From outside, heavy curtains obscured any view of the interior, thick velvet that looked original to the house despite the elements it had endured. But she could see that the window itself was larger than it appeared in the 1873 photograph, the frame modified at some point to let in more light, or perhaps, she thought with a chill, to let someone see out more clearly, to give a prisoner a better view of the freedom they'd been denied. A sound echoed from somewhere below them, rising through the old floorboards like a whisper from the past. Both Rebecca and Daniel froze, their bodies tensing as every sense sharpened to compensate for their racing thoughts. The sound came again, a rhythmic creaking like footsteps on old floorboards, deliberate and slow, each step measured and purposeful. Rebecca's rational mind immediately supplied explanations, the house settling under its own ancient weight, wind against loose boards weathered by a century of New England seasons, the heating system finally coming to life with groans and complaints. But her instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution, designed to keep her ancestors alive in dangerous environments, screamed something entirely different. Something was wrong. Something was watching. Something knew they were here. "Maybe we should come back tomorrow with Mr. Lancaster," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible, his face pale in the dim light filtering through dust-covered windows. Rebecca shook her head, surprising herself with her own determination. They'd come this far. They'd uncovered evidence of disappearances, of children who'd vanished without explanation, of a family that had kept terrible secrets for generations. Whatever answers this house held, whatever Eleanor Caldwell had experienced in her final days, Rebecca needed to find them. Not just as an archivist, not just as a historian, but as someone who believed that truth mattered, that the disappeared deserved to be remembered, that silence was complicity in whatever crimes had been committed here. She tried the door handle again, pushing harder, feeling the old wood shudder against her weight, but refusing to yield its secrets. Then she noticed it, a thin gap between the doorframe and the wall, partially hidden by layers of Victorian wallpaper that had been carefully applied to conceal the irregularity. Someone had plastered over the original opening and created a new, smaller entrance, sealing something inside or keeping something out. But the old doorframe was still there, visible if you knew where to look, betraying the architectural manipulation that had occurred decades or perhaps even a century ago. "Help me with this," she said, her voice steadier now that she had a clear objective. She ran her fingers along the wallpaper seam, feeling the raised edge where one layer ended and another began. Together they found the edge and began to carefully peel it back, revealing the history of the house in reverse. The paper came away in long strips, releasing a musty smell of old paste and trapped air. Beneath the current layer was another, and beneath that another, like peeling back the years themselves. Finally, they reached the plaster underneath, lighter in color than the surrounding walls, its texture different, newer. Daniel pulled a multi-tool from his pocket, the same Swiss Army knife his grandfather had given him for his 18th birthday, and began carefully chipping at the plaster with the screwdriver attachment. It came away easily, too easily, crumbling like chalk in places, as if it had never fully hardened despite the decades it had been in place. Behind it was wood, not a solid wall, but boards nailed vertically, rough-hewn planks that had been hastily installed. The nail heads were rusted, some barely holding. This wasn't professional carpentry. This was someone sealing a room in desperation or haste, or both. "Someone sealed this room," Rebecca said, stating the obvious but needing to hear it said aloud, needing to process the implications. Not just locked it, they sealed it completely. They didn't want anyone to get in, or they didn't want something to get out. They worked for 20 minutes, removing enough boards to create an opening. The wood was old and brittle, and several planks snapped completely. Finally, they had a gap large enough to slip through. Rebecca turned on her phone's flashlight and aimed it through the opening. Eleanor's room was exactly as she'd left it in 1873. The bed was unmade, covers thrown back as if the occupant had risen quickly. A nightgown lay crumpled on the floor. A doll sat in a small chair by the window, its painted eyes reflecting Rebecca's light. But what drew her attention was the walls. Every surface was covered in writing. Rebecca squeezed through the gap, Daniel following close behind. The writing covered the walls from floor to ceiling, scrawled in what appeared to be charcoal or pencil, layer upon layer of text, creating a dense tapestry of words. Much of it was illegible, overlapping and faded with age. But as Rebecca moved closer, certain phrases became clear. They watch. They always watch. The doors don't open. The windows don't open. Nothing opens. Mother says it's for our safety. Father says it's necessary. But they're afraid. I can see they're afraid. Charlotte cries at night. Victoria prays. James has stopped speaking altogether. The words were written in different hands, different styles. Rebecca realized with growing horror that this wasn't just Eleanor's writing. Multiple children had written on these walls, adding their messages over years. Daniel was examining the window. "Rebecca, look at this." He pointed to the frame. Deep gouges marred the wood, as if someone had tried to force it open with their bare hands. The window itself had been painted shut, multiple layers obscuring the glass. But when Daniel touched the paint, his finger came away dusty. The final layer had never fully hardened. Rebecca moved to the small writing desk in the corner. A diary lay open, the leather cover stained and brittle. She photographed each page carefully before attempting to read the faded ink. The entries were dated from September to November 1873, written in a child's careful hand. September 12th, 1873. Father says we must stay indoors now, that the world outside is too dangerous. Mother cries when she thinks we cannot hear. Charlotte asked why we cannot go to school anymore, and Father struck her. He has never struck us before. September 28th, 1873. James tried to leave through the cellar door last night. Father found him and locked him in his room. We heard him screaming for hours. This morning his door was open, but James was different. He won't look at us anymore. He just stares at the walls. October 15th, 1873. Victoria says there are 9 of us now, not 8. She says the 9th one watches us from the mirrors and windows. Father says Victoria is having delusions and should not be believed. But I have seen her too, the girl who looks like me but isn't me. October 31st, 1873. They took Charlotte today. Father and the men in dark coats came while we were having breakfast. Charlotte screamed and fought, but they carried her away. Mother tried to stop them, and Father hit her. He said Charlotte was sick, that she needed special treatment. That we might all need special treatment if we don't behave. I am so frightened. November 18th, 1873. I heard Charlotte last night. I know it was her. She was crying, calling for Mother. The sound came from beneath my floor. There is something under this house, something terrible. I tried to tell Victoria, but she just shakes her head and whispers that we must be quiet. That if we're quiet and good, they won't take us too. The final entry was dated November 20th, 1873, written in a shaking hand. They are coming for me. I can hear them on the stairs. Father has that look in his eyes again, the look that isn't Father anymore. Mother won't help. She just stares at the wall and weeps. I tried the window again, but it won't open. None of the doors open. We are not children anymore. We are prisoners. And I think whatever they did to Charlotte, whatever made her cry out from beneath the floor, they are going to do to me. If anyone finds this, please know that we loved each other. We tried to save each other. But some cages have no keys. Rebecca's hands trembled as she lowered the diary. Daniel stood by the window. his face pale in the beam of her flashlight. "What happened in this house?" he whispered. Before Rebecca could answer, the flashlight flickered. Then the lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, they heard it. Footsteps in the hallway below, slow and measured, moving toward the stairs. Rebecca's phone screen provided the only light, a pale blue glow that barely penetrated the darkness of Eleanor's sealed room. Daniel grabbed her arm, his breathing rapid. "We need to leave, now." The footsteps continued their slow ascent. Rebecca forced herself to think rationally. The house was empty. Mr. Lancaster had confirmed it. The security system would have alerted them if someone had entered. These were old house sounds, nothing more. But even as she tried to convince herself, every instinct screamed that something was wrong. They squeezed back through the gap they'd created, emerging into the second-floor hallway. Rebecca aimed her phone's light toward the staircase. The footsteps had stopped. In the silence, she could hear Daniel's ragged breathing and her own heart hammering against her ribs. "The electrical panel must be in the basement," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The system is over 100 years old. It probably just overloaded." "Or someone shut it off," Daniel countered. Rebecca didn't want to consider that possibility. They moved carefully toward the main staircase, the phone's light revealing glimpses of the hallway, closed doors, family portraits, a grandfather clock that had stopped at 3:17. She wanted to get downstairs, get to the front door, get out of this house that felt increasingly like a trap. They were halfway down the stairs when Rebecca's phone died. The darkness was total. Not even ambient light from windows penetrated this interior space. Rebecca felt Daniel's hand grip her shoulder as they stood frozen, neither willing to move without the ability to see. Her other senses heightened in compensation. She smelled that sweet decay more strongly now, mixed with something metallic. And she heard breathing, soft and regular, that wasn't hers or Daniel's. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. "We're archivists working with Mr. Lancaster. We have permission to be here." No answer. Just that soft breathing, somewhere below them in the darkness. Daniel pulled out his own phone, and the screen illuminated their immediate surroundings. They were near the bottom of the staircase, the front door visible at the end of the entrance hall. 20 feet, that's all that separated them from safety. They descended the remaining steps quickly, practically running for the door. Rebecca's hand closed on the handle and turned. The door didn't move. She tried again, yanking harder. The lock held firm. "The deadbolt," Daniel said, his light finding the mechanism. But when Rebecca tried to turn it, the bolt wouldn't move. It was stuck or jammed or locked from the outside. Panic started to rise in her throat. Daniel aimed his phone at the windows flanking the door. The shutters were closed from the inside, locked with iron bars. They moved through the first floor, checking every window, every door. All sealed, all locked. The house that had welcomed them an hour ago had become a prison. "This isn't possible," Rebecca said, her voice rising. "We came in through that door. It wasn't locked from the outside. Someone did this. Someone locked us in." She pulled out her phone, trying to power it on. Dead, completely drained, despite having a full charge moments ago. Daniel's phone showed the same impossible depletion, the battery icon dropping from 80% to 0% even as they watched. "The basement," Daniel said. "The electrical panel. If we can restore power, the electronic lock on the front door might release." Rebecca nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed against going deeper into this house. They found the basement door off the kitchen, a heavy wooden barrier that opened with a groan. Steep stairs descended into absolute darkness. Using Daniel's rapidly dying phone, they descended. The basement was vast, extending under the entire footprint of the house. Ancient stone walls wept with moisture, and the floor was hard-packed dirt. Wooden support posts stood like sentinels in the gloom. But what drew Rebecca's attention was the wall at the far end of the basement. It was newer than the foundation, constructed of brick rather than stone, and in the center was a door, newer still, fitted with a modern padlock. "What is that?" Daniel whispered. Rebecca approached slowly, her borrowed light catching details. The door was reinforced steel, painted to look like wood. The frame was welded into the brick, creating an impenetrable seal. This wasn't original to the house. Someone had added this recently. Within the last 50 years, if Rebecca's assessment was correct, the padlock was substantial, a heavy-duty mechanism designed to prevent forced entry. But as Rebecca examined it, she noticed something odd. The lock wasn't engaged. The shackle was open, resting in the mechanism, but not actually securing the hasp. "Should we open it?" Daniel asked. Rebecca thought of Eleanor's diary, the crying from beneath the floor, Charlotte's screams. "I don't think we have a choice. If there's a way out of this house, it might be through there." She lifted the padlock away and pulled the door open. A tunnel stretched before them, hand-dug through the earth, the walls shored up with timbers. Electric lights were strung along the ceiling, currently dark. The air that flowed from the tunnel was cold and carried that sweet, rotten smell so strongly that Rebecca gagged. They had no choice but to enter. Daniel's phone finally died, leaving them in complete darkness. Rebecca kept one hand on the rough wall, moving forward slowly, counting her steps. 20, 40, 60. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, and Rebecca realized they were moving away from the house, underground, towards something. At 80 steps, her hand found another door. This one was unlocked, and it swung open easily. On the other side, a room, and in that room, lights suddenly blazed to life, so bright after the darkness that Rebecca had to shield her eyes. When her vision cleared, she saw Thomas Lancaster standing in the center of the room, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry, Dr. Hart," he said. "I truly am. But you couldn't leave well enough alone." The room was circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, carved from the bedrock beneath Salem. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, and covering every inch of the walls were photographs. Hundreds of them, thousands, black and white images stretching back over a century, showing children, teenagers, and young adults. Many were formal portraits, others were candid shots, taken without the subject's knowledge. But what unified them was the terror in their eyes. Rebecca recognized Eleanor Caldwell in dozens of photos, aging from 9 to perhaps 14 before the images stopped. Charlotte was there too, and Victoria and James, and dozens of others, children and young people, whose faces Rebecca had seen in the Caldwell family albums. But there were contemporary photos too, recent images, digital prints showing modern teenagers and young adults. The most recent were dated within the last year. These weren't historical documents. This was ongoing. "What is this?" Rebecca demanded, her voice shaking. "What did you do?" Lancaster moved to a filing cabinet against the wall and pulled out a thick folder. "The Caldwell family has maintained a tradition for nearly 230 years. They understood something fundamental about freedom that most people refuse to acknowledge. Freedom is chaos. Freedom is danger. Society requires order, structure, control. And the Caldwell family dedicated themselves to protecting young people from the dangers of freedom." "You're insane," Daniel said, backing toward the door they'd entered through. But Lancaster shook his head. "The door behind you only opens from this side, and Dr. Hart's investigation has made it clear that the secret can no longer be maintained. The photograph she found, Eleanor's diary, all the evidence Margaret Caldwell promised to destroy, but instead carefully preserved. It's all coming to light now." He opened the folder, revealing documents. The Caldwell family didn't just disappear their own children. They operated a private institution, what we might today call a re-education center. Wealthy families across New England sent their troublesome children here, the ones who asked too many questions, who rebelled against authority, who sought freedom over security. Rebecca's mind reeled, connecting pieces. The photograph, the ninth reflection, that wasn't supernatural. That was a girl imprisoned inside the house, looking out while the acceptable children posed outside. Exactly. Margaret Caldwell was brilliant in her way. She maintained the family tradition until her illness made it impossible to continue. I've been managing the practical aspects for the last 30 years. The legal paperwork, the financial arrangements with families who want their children corrected. We help parents regain control. We teach young people the value of obedience. "Where are they?" Rebecca demanded. "The people in these photographs, the recent ones. Where are they?" Lancaster gestured to another door on the opposite side of the room. "Beyond there. The facility extends quite extensively underground. Multiple levels. We can house up to 40 individuals at any given time. Currently, we have 32 residents ranging in age from 13 to 24. All sent here by parents or guardians who recognized that freedom had poisoned their children's minds." Daniel lunged for the door, but Lancaster was faster. He pulled a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. Gas began hissing from vents in the ceiling. "I'm genuinely sorry," Lancaster said as Rebecca's vision began to swim. "You seem like decent people, but the work here is too important. Society is fragmenting. Young people are losing respect for authority, for tradition, for the structures that keep civilization functioning. We provide a corrective, and we can't allow that mission to be compromised." Rebecca tried to reach for something, anything to use as a weapon, but her limbs wouldn't respond. The gas was fast-acting, pulling her down into darkness. Her last conscious thought was of those 32 people imprisoned somewhere below, and the message Eleanor had written on her wall. "Some cages have no keys." Rebecca woke to the sound of breathing, not her own. Multiple people close by, their rhythms overlapping in the darkness. Her head throbbed, and her mouth tasted of chemicals. She tried to move, and found her arms bound, zip ties cutting into her wrists. She was sitting on a cold floor, her back against a wall. "She's awake," someone whispered. A young woman's voice, weary and resigned. Rebecca's eyes adjusted slowly. She was in a large room, perhaps 30 feet square, with concrete walls and a single door. Dim emergency lighting provided just enough illumination to see shapes. Daniel was beside her, still unconscious, and around the perimeter of the room sat others. Young people just as Lancaster had described. 32 souls who'd been disappeared, erased from the world above. "How long have I been out?" Rebecca asked. "About 3 hours," the voice replied. A young woman emerged from the shadows, perhaps 19 or 20, with short dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. "I'm Mara. Welcome to the Caldwell Institute for Behavioral Correction, although welcome isn't really the right word." Rebecca struggled against her bonds. "We need to get out. There are police, people who know we came here." "No one knows you're here," another voice said. A young man, Asian, thin and angular. "That's the point. Lancaster is very good at making people vanish. He has contacts in law enforcement, in government, in the media. When someone disappears into this place, they simply cease to exist above ground." But I'm a county archivist," Rebecca protested. "People will look for me, my colleagues, my family." Mara shook her head sadly. "Lancaster will handle it. A car accident, a sudden family emergency requiring you to leave town. A carefully crafted paper trail showing you plan to take time off. It's what he does, and the longer you're down here, the more thoroughly your old life will be erased until no one even remembers to look for you anymore." Daniel groaned, coming to consciousness. Rebecca quickly explained their situation while someone in the group found a sharp edge and began working on their zip ties. It took 20 minutes, but eventually their hands were free. Rebecca rubbed her wrists, looking around at the faces surrounding them. So young. Most were teenagers, though a few appeared to be in their early 20s. All bore the same look of hopeless resignation. "Tell me how this works," Rebecca said. "How does Lancaster keep you all here?" A young man named Marcus explained. He'd been brought here 2 years ago by his parents after coming out as gay. "The facility is completely underground, 3 levels connected by that tunnel system. This is the holding level. Above us is what they call the correction level. That's where the real work happens. Isolation cells, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and the conversations, endless conversations about obedience, about the dangers of freedom, about learning to accept proper authority." "And the top level?" Rebecca asked. "Administrative. That's where Lancaster has his office, where the guards sleep, where they keep the supplies. It connects directly to the basement of the Caldwell mansion. There are 2 other exits, but they're hidden. One comes out in the woods 3 miles north. The other is in the old textile mill, where Lancaster's law office is located. All the entrances are sealed from the outside. We can't get out without someone opening the doors from above." Rebecca stood, testing her legs. "How many guards?" "Usually 4 at night, 8 during the day. All former military or law enforcement. They're well paid and completely loyal, or completely amoral, hard to tell the difference." This from a girl who couldn't have been more than 15. "I've been here for 11 months. My parents sent me because I protested outside a political rally. They said I was being radicalized by social media. Lancaster convinced them I needed correction." The stories poured out. A young man who'd written articles critical of government overreach. A woman who'd organized labor protests at her college. A teenager who'd been vocal about climate change. Some had been sent by parents genuinely convinced they were helping their children. Others had been committed through legal guardianships obtained under suspicious circumstances. But all shared one thing: they'd exercised their freedom in ways that threatened someone's sense of order. "This is impossible," Daniel said. "This is America. You can't just imprison people for thinking freely." "You can if you have enough money and the right connections," Mara replied. "Lancaster has both, and he's careful. He only takes people who won't be missed too much. Runaways, troubled teens whose parents have already documented behavioral issues, young adults estranged from their families, people who society is already half willing to forget." Rebecca thought of the photographs in that circular room, generations of disappeared people. How many have been through here, over the years? We don't know exactly, but based on what some of the long-term residents have pieced together, probably thousands. Some are released after their families stop paying, or the resident is successfully broken and deemed corrected, but many just vanish. Lancaster says they're transferred to other facilities. We think he kills them. The room fell silent. Rebecca looked at these young people, at the hope that still flickered despite everything they'd endured, and felt rage building. This wasn't just imprisonment. It was the systematic destruction of the human spirit, all in the name of control and order. "We're getting out," she said. "All of us." Over the next hours, as the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and guards made their rounds according to schedules they believed were unpredictable, but were actually as regular as clockwork, Rebecca learned the layout of the facility from those who'd been here longest. Marcus drew diagrams in the dust on the floor, using his finger to trace corridors and levels, while others contributed their knowledge, building a collective map of their prison. The Caldwell Institute was a labyrinth, designed specifically to disorient and contain, with dead ends and confusing turns that would defeat any escape attempt by someone unfamiliar with its layout. But it had weaknesses that the guards didn't know existed, vulnerabilities that only those who'd lived here for months or years could perceive. The guards had patterns, schedules they adhered to with military precision. The cameras had blind spots. The doors required key cards, but several residents had observed over countless hours of patient watching that the cards themselves were often left unattended in the administrative office during shift changes, when guards gathered for coffee and conversation, believing their prisoners too broken or too frightened to pose any real threat. And most importantly, Lancaster was arrogant. His wealth, his connections, his decades of operating with impunity had convinced him that he was untouchable, that the system he'd built was infallible, that the children and young adults imprisoned below ground were simply assets to be managed rather than human beings capable of resistance. They formulated a plan over whispered conversations that paused whenever a guard approached. Whenever a security camera panned in their direction, it was desperate and dangerous, with a dozen points where everything could go catastrophically wrong. But it was something. It was hope. It was action rather than resignation. Rebecca would convince Lancaster that she and Daniel were broken, willing to cooperate in exchange for their freedom, that they understood his philosophy and saw the wisdom in his methods. Once moved to a less secure area, they'd overpower a guard and access the keycard system, while creating chaos throughout the facility, triggering every alarm and opening every door. The residents would make their coordinated escape through multiple exits that had been carefully mapped and discussed. It took 3 days to set up, 3 days of playing broken, of convincing Lancaster through careful performances that the fight had gone out of them. Rebecca used her knowledge of history, of similar institutions that had existed throughout American history, to engage Lancaster in intellectual discussions about social control. She let him believe she was beginning to understand his perspective. On the third night, Lancaster agreed to move them to the administrative level. He was so convinced of his control that he had only one guard escort them up through the facility. Daniel waited until they were in a narrow corridor, then made his move. The guard was professional, but ultimately human. Surprised by the sudden attack, he went down. Daniel grabbed his keycard, while Rebecca secured his radio. Alarms began immediately, but the plan was in motion. Rebecca ran for the control room she'd mapped in her discussions with Lancaster. Daniel headed for the main entrance to hold it open. Behind them, 32 prisoners who'd found hope again in the last 3 days began their escape. The control room was locked, but the key card opened it. Inside, banks of monitors showed the facility. Rebecca could see guards mobilizing, residents running through corridors. She found the master control panel and did what she'd planned. She initiated the emergency ventilation system, which would automatically unlock all interior doors to prevent suffocation in case of fire. Every cell, every holding room, every secured entrance began to open. Lancaster's voice crackled over the radio. "Dr. Hart, you're making a terrible mistake. You don't understand what you're unleashing. These people are dangerous. They reject proper authority. They threaten social order." Rebecca keyed the radio. "These people are free human beings, and you're going to answer for what you've done." She grabbed a digital recorder from the control panel, knowing it would contain security footage, and ran. The facility was chaos now. Guards tried to contain the situation, but they were outnumbered. Rebecca saw Mara leading a group toward the northern exit, Marcus helping younger residents navigate the corridors. Daniel had managed to open the main entrance, and residents were pouring out into the tunnel that led to the Caldwell mansion basement. Rebecca joined the flow, helping those who stumbled, pulling the slowest to their feet. Behind them, guards shouted and alarms wailed, but momentum was with the escaped prisoners now. They burst into the mansion basement and up into the house itself. Dawn light filtered through the windows, painting everything gold. Rebecca had never seen anything more beautiful than that light. Someone had managed to unlock the front door from inside, and the group spilled out onto the lawn, into the November morning, into freedom. Police arrived within 20 minutes, summoned by security system alerts. At first, there was confusion. Lancaster had already called them himself, reporting an escape of dangerous patients from a private mental health facility. But Rebecca had the digital recorder, and she had 32 witnesses, and most importantly, she had Eleanor Caldwell's diary, still in her jacket pocket from 3 days ago. The story broke slowly at first, then exploded into national news. The Caldwell Institute, a private prison masquerading as a correctional facility, generations of disappeared people, Lancaster's arrest, the discovery of 4 bodies buried in the woods near the northern exit, residents who'd tried to escape in previous years. The investigation revealed connections to dozens of wealthy families across New England, politicians who'd used the facility to disappear troublesome relatives, even law enforcement officials who'd looked the other way in exchange for payments. The conspiracy went deep, touching institutions that Americans had trusted to protect them. But what captured public imagination was the photograph. The 9 faces in the reflection of that 1873 image. Eleanor Caldwell, trapped behind glass, screaming silently while her siblings posed for a camera. It became a symbol, reproduced in newspapers and on television, representing every disappeared person, every voice silenced in the name of order and control. 6 months later, on a warm May afternoon when spring had finally driven away the last remnants of New England winter, Rebecca stood in the newly renovated Essex County Archives, preparing for the opening of a permanent exhibition that had consumed every waking hour of her life since the escape. The Disappeared, a history of the Caldwell Institute and the fight for freedom, would tell the full story. From Eleanor Caldwell's first diary entry to the present day, spanning 151 years of systematic oppression disguised as correction and care. Every photograph from that underground chamber would be displayed, each one a face restored to history, a name rescued from oblivion. Every disappeared person's name would be recorded on a memorial wall, etched in stone so they could never be erased again. It was the largest and most controversial exhibition in the archive's 140-year history, and Rebecca had fought for months to make it happen, battling board members who feared lawsuits, politicians who worried about embarrassing prominent families, and attorneys who insisted that some things were better left in the past where they couldn't hurt anyone anymore. Mara was there for the opening, looking healthy and strong in a way she hadn't 6 months ago, along with Marcus and many of the other survivors who'd found the courage to attend despite the trauma of returning to Salem, to the city that had imprisoned them. They'd formed a tight-knit support network, meeting weekly in person and daily online, helping each other rebuild lives that had been stolen, navigate a world that had continued without them, and process trauma that most therapists had no experience treating. Some had reconciled with families who genuinely believed they were helping by sending their children to Lancaster, who'd been deceived by his professional manner and convincing arguments. Others had cut ties completely with those who'd betrayed them, who'd valued control over love, obedience over freedom. But all of them understood something profound about freedom now. Something most people would never truly comprehend: how fragile it was, how easily it could be taken away, how vigilantly it needed to be protected against those who would trade liberty for the comfortable illusion of security. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Mara asked, looking at the exhibition panels. "Knowing what happened here." Rebecca thought about Eleanor's last diary entry, about the phrase that had haunted her for months. "Some cages have no keys." She looked at the young people around her, survivors who'd escaped one of those cages through courage and determination and desperate hope. "Freedom isn't something you have," Rebecca said. "It's something you fight for, every day, every generation. The moment people stop fighting, stop questioning authority, stop demanding their rights, the cages start building again. Maybe this exhibition will remind people of that. Maybe it'll make them vigilant." They walked through the exhibition together, reading the stories of those who'd been imprisoned in the name of order. At the end of the display was Eleanor's photograph, enlarged to life-size. 9 faces staring from that reflection, including one that shouldn't have been there. Underneath, Rebecca had placed Eleanor's final words. "If anyone finds this, please know that we loved each other. We tried to save each other, but some cages have no keys," and then added by Rebecca, "until someone makes one." The exhibition opened to the public the next day. Over the following weeks, thousands visited, reading the stories, studying the faces, learning about the price of surrendering freedom in exchange for security. The investigation into the Caldwell Institute continued, revealing more connections, more disappeared people, more families who'd participated in the conspiracy of silence. Thomas Lancaster was sentenced to life in prison without parole, along with 4 of his guards. Dozens of parents faced charges ranging from false imprisonment to conspiracy. The Caldwell mansion was demolished, the underground facility filled with concrete, the land turned into a memorial park. But Rebecca knew the fight wasn't over. History taught her that people would always exist who believed freedom was dangerous, who thought control and order mattered more than liberty. The forms would change, the methods would evolve, but the fundamental struggle between freedom and control would continue as long as humanity existed. She returned to her office that evening, exhausted but satisfied. On her desk sat a new donation to the archive, recently discovered documents from another old Salem family. As she opened the first box, beginning her review, she wondered what stories these papers would tell, what forgotten histories they might reveal, because that was her job now, not just preserving the past, but bringing hidden truths to light, making sure the disappeared were remembered, ensuring that the cages, when they appeared, would be recognized for what they were. And that someone would always be watching, always questioning, always willing to fight for freedom. The 9th face in Eleanor Caldwell's photograph had waited 151 years to be seen. Rebecca was determined that no one would have to wait that long again.